If you've ever tried to understand Melanie Klein's theories, you likely felt overwhelmed by the onslaught of terms such as the Paranoid-Schizoid Position, Depressive Position, the good and the bad breast, splitting, annihilation anxiety, life and death instinct. She didn't make it easy to understand her theory. But that is a pity, because despite being controversial and weird, there is also something interesting to her ideas. So in this video, we will simplify and clarify her theory to understand why ambivalence is a good thing, where creativity comes from, why someone's exes may all be narcissists, and how all of this applies to Harry Potter. Before we get there, if you're new here, hi, my name is Alina. I'm a German psychologist and currently in training to become a psychodynamic psychotherapist and psychoanalyst. On this channel, we talk about psychodynamic theory, so if this is something for you, feel free to subscribe and check out the links below in the description box for more opportunities to learn, read, or work with me. You can read any of these books looking for flaws, and spoiler alert, you'll find loads. There's a lot to criticize Klein and Kleinians for. Or you can read them looking for interesting new ideas that spark your own curiosity. And today we choose to indulge in new weird ideas to see what we can get from them. There are timestamps below so that you can find exactly what you're looking for. But I suggest before we try to understand her theory, we need to take a minute to dive into her remarkable life, because you cannot divorce the thinker from the theory. If I had to summarize Melanie Klein's life in one sentence, it would be unrelenting power in the face of hardship. Her forceful, authoritarian, direct personality is what got her through one devastating loss after the other. It helped her jump into a very successful career and also led to painful alienation in both her professional and private life. Klein was born in 1882 in Vienna, loses her old father, one sister and brother, all before she got married, having just turned 21. She soon developed a depression that worsened while raising 3 children and being her husband's trailing spouse. And she actually started her own analysis in 1914 with Sandor Ferenczi. She read Freud, heard Freud speak for the first time, and in that process, not just her depression lifted, but her life was forever changed. She started publishing her own papers, divorced her husband, moved first to Berlin, then settled in London. She becomes one of the pioneers to the still new field of psychoanalysis, one of the first to develop the new discipline of child analysis, and used her newly gained insight to become one of the leading contributors to object relations theory. I made a whole different video about that. And she did all this without a university degree to her name, at a time where psychoanalysis was dominated by male medical doctors. I mean, her biography is quite something. I'll link a timeline below from the Melanie Klein Trust, so if you want to learn more, feel free to check that out. Klein considered herself a Freudian in many ways, even though she later became the worst rival of Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. And this, affiliation showed first and foremost when she took Freud's most controversial concept and made it the backbone of her theory. The foundation of every theory is a certain worldview, a certain way of thinking about what it means to be human. And one of Klein's controversial assumptions that underpins her theoretical ideas is the idea of the life and death instinct. This is an idea she took from Freud, which was also his most controversial idea that he first discussed in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920. And to be precise, Freud didn't talk about the life and death instinct. He talked about the life and death drive, Lebens- und Todestrieb, or Eros, the libido and Thanatos. This was the ultimate reformulation of his drive theory, trying to answer the question, what internal forces, drive the human being. The death drive can be a very tricky subject to wrap your head around the first time, and that would probably require an entire video, but let me try to give you at least, a very, very brief summary. According to Freud, from the very beginning, there is something inside of us that strives towards renewal, creating excitement and tension. And there's something inside of us that strives towards relief from tension, letting go, returning to an inanimate state. And it actually can be easier to understand drives in action, so what might they look like? According to Freud's previous theory, a drive can be directed towards the self or the object. And the life instinct, libido, in action directed towards the self or the object, is what we might call love, ranging from mature love to dependency and realistic self-esteem to narcissism. The death drive in action is what we would call aggression, ranging from setting healthy boundaries, achieving mastery, power, solving conflicts, to the destruction of others or the self. There has been a tendency in psychodynamic psychology to move from drives to affect, to emotions, and we can see here, in Klein, that would then be expanded on by Canberg and so on. They understand the death drive as our innate capability for destruction, aggression, hate, versus libido as our innate capacity for love, reparation, and empathy. This is actually how Klein turned Freud's biological concepts into psychological ones. The integration of and dealing with our death drive, our own ability for destruction, is a lifelong task. And early on in infants, Klein thought it is the primary factor in the causation of anxiety. Someone who hasn't yet found a way to deal with their death instinct is much more frightened of it. And the first way the ego of the infant, whose primary function is dealing with anxiety, does to calm the anxiety elicited by the death instinct is the hallmark of Klein's famed concept of the Paranoid-Schizoid Position. Before we go there, why did Klein use the term position? Klein's positions are not developmental steps that you achieve once and you keep forever. Her positions are ways of experience and making sense of and dealing with the inner and outer world. Klein assumed that an ego is present since birth. Freud, on the other hand, assumed that the ego actually develops out of the id with time. And however, this ego is not yet integrated, coherent, but one of the main functions, even of the early ego, is to deal with anxiety. And a position then is an attempt of the ego to deal with anxiety elicited by the death instinct through defenses that create characteristic ideas about and relations between the self and another person. This is what we would call an object relation. A position is a combination of a certain form of anxiety, defenses against it, and a resulting self-object relation. And this might all sound quite vague, but we'll clarify what exactly that means when we talk about the two positions in detail. So keep in mind that positions are states of mind that are there to deal with anxiety and can be inhibited and also abandoned temporarily as we grow older. Now let's see what those anxieties are that we need to defend against, starting with the Paranoid-Schizoid Position. In 1946, Klein's paper, Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanism, hits the British Psychoanalytic Society like another fever dream. It's considered one of Klein's most important papers in which she properly introduces the Paranoid-Schizoid Position and the defenses of splitting and projective identification. I actually do recommend reading this. It's the first paper in her collection, called Envy and Gratitude. This is it. And also, the Envy and Gratitude paper itself. It can seem a bit intimidating to dive into original literature, but it's a somewhat doable read, especially if you first watch this video and have somewhat of an idea of how to make sense of her terrible terminology. And by the way, I'm also trying to gather my notes and make them available to you if you sign up for my newsletter, so that is probably going to be linked below. Overall, the Paranoid-Schizoid Position is a state of mind that, according to Klein, is prevalent in the first 3 months of life, and then, gradually decreases throughout childhood and adolescence. In normal development, it's assumed to only reappear occasionally under great stress, but it is assumed to be the prevalent state of mind for people suffering from various schizophrenic illnesses. As we've covered before, Klein assumes an innate death instinct and that anxiety arises from the operation of the death instinct within the organism. We cannot experience a drive itself, but we can experience a drive and action, what it does to us or makes us do. So she continues that this anxiety is felt as a fear of annihilation. According to Klein, an infant is afraid of being annihilated. This is a part of, what the term paranoid refers to. I mean, what a start. Luckily, that's not the only thing that is happening because, remember, there's also the life instinct. Hannah Segal, one of Melanie Klein's most famous students, writes, the immature ego of the infant is exposed from birth to the anxiety stirred up by the inborn polarity of instincts, the immediate conflict between the life instinct and the death instinct. It is also immediately exposed to the impact of external reality, both anxiety-producing, like the trauma of birth, and life-giving, like the warmth, love, and feeding received from its mother. So the mind of a newborn, the infant, becomes the stage of an existential drama. How can life survive death? How can love win over hate? The ego of the infant has to find a way to manage this anxiety and survive. The first step to save life from death and love from hate is to try to keep them as far away from each other as possible so that hate doesn't contaminate love. To do that, the ego uses the defense mechanism of splitting, which is the schizoid mechanism. The early ego that has not integrated itself splits love from hate, life from death, to keep love safe from the hate that would otherwise destroy and annihilate it. From an outside perspective, it's so hard to get an idea what exactly is going on in an infant, in the mind of an infant. Early mental life must just be chaos. I mean, imagine having no language, no memory, just bodily sensations like hunger, tiredness, with no way to make sense of them, which you could imagine might feel like a danger of annihilation. And the link between aggression and hunger is clear to anyone who has ever been hangry. We can observe that infants seem to live in one of two states. Either they're fed, calm, comfortable, or they're hungry, agitated, uncomfortable, which, kind of maps onto, the life and death instinct. And to split, this very chaotic experience into two is not such a bad idea to make sense of the chaos and feel a little less anxious. Now, Melanie Klein gets a bad rap for apparently not caring about the impact of the external world and the real mother. But, again, if you read her papers after you've watched this video, I don't think you'd agree that she doesn't take it into account. So let's take a look at what the next defense against annihilation anxiety is and what the mother has to do with it. The first step to lessen annihilation anxiety is splitting, to keep death instinct from destroying the life within. In order to create even more distance between love and hate, the ego uses another defense mechanism, namely projection. This is where the good and the bad breast come in. The infant experiences good and bad states in connection to the breast or the bottle. It's the first relation between the self and, a so-called part object. And part object because the breast or the bottle is just a part of the whole object, the whole person. Even though the infant still experiences the part object as a part of the self, there's not yet an awareness that the breast belongs to the mother, who is a separate person. So if the breast provides milk at the right time, in the right quality, with the right speed, the self, the infant, feels good and experiences the breast as good. And if the breast doesn't give milk, or not at the right time, not in the right quality, or not the right speed, the self feels bad and experiences the breast as bad. And in simple terms, to gain even more distance from one's own destructive impulses, the ego projects, it puts those hateful feelings into the bad breast. A part of the death instinct is then projected out. It's saying, no, actually there's nothing destructive inside of me. It's all out there where I can fight it and destroy it. This is where Klein completes the paranoid bit, when she expands that Anxiety arises from the operation of the death instinct within the organism, is felt as fear of annihilation, death, and takes the form of fear of persecution. If any of you have seen my video about the psychoanalysis of Dwight Schrute from The Office, I think this is a nice case study where I explain more about the paranoid personality style. So if you're interested, I'll link that below. Then consequently, all the infant's hate is directed against the bad breast. It bites, it pinches, it screams at, and hits that which it believes is out to destroy him. And on the other hand, it desperately needs and idealizes the good breast because it is not only the food he desires, but also wants to be freed from destructive impulses and persecutory anxiety. The good breast is the savior, and the bad breast is the persecutor. The consequence of splitting, the schizoid mechanism, is that we have split object relations. There is no integration. Splitting and projection not just allow to keep love and hate apart from each other, but also allow to deny that the bad object and destruction even exists. And here, Melanie Klein says something so beautifully. Omnipotent denial of the existence of the bad object and of the painful situation is in the unconscious equal to annihilation by the destructive impulse. It is, however, not only a situation and an object that are denied and annihilated, it is an object relation which suffers this fate, and therefore a part of the ego from which the feelings towards the object emanate is denied and annihilated as well. I think this nicely links to Jung's idea about the creation of the shadow, it seems. Every time that the destructive impulse becomes too much, there is another split in the object and the ego, and potentially more and more potency, strength, and knowledge denied and lost. For love to win over hate, the infant can try to get rid of the death drive, or at least parts of it, which we have talked about with the mechanisms of splitting and projection. But it can also try to strengthen the life instinct within, which happens through introjection of the good breast. The life instinct is first projected into the good breast, we talked about that, and through the gratifying experience reintrojected into the ego. This process of balanced projection and introjection helps to establish what is called the good inner object within the self. It might sound a bit strange, but at the end of the day, the good inner object is the inner voice that says, you might not be perfect, but you're a good person, or you've worked hard today, maybe it's time for a cup of tea, or, it's critical in a constructive way, like, you don't need to act this way. This doesn't align with who you are on the inside. And as the good inner object gets stronger, eventually the confidence that life can actually overcome death, that love is more powerful than hate, grows. And this is necessary to create coherence, integration, and counteract the splitting which could cause disintegration. When the infant feels it less necessary to keep love and hate that far apart, because it no longer feels like it will be destroyed, it slowly starts realizing that the good and bad breast was the same all along, which throws it into the next kind of anxiety and the depressive position. A good illustration of how we move from the paranoid-schizoid to the depressive position is Harry Potter. In the beginning, love and hate are clearly separate. It allows us to fully identify with Harry Potter and despise Voldemort and Snape. Once Harry reconnected enough with his good inner objects, more complexity becomes possible. We start seeing that things aren't as black and white. We get to know Tom Riddle, the man behind Voldemort, and can empathize with his traumatic past. Then revealing Snape's backstory might be one of the most moving twists in this series of books. Beyond the hostile exterior, there's a complex mixture of love, loyalty, and the ultimate sacrifice. And I assume anyone reading the book felt guilty about how they hated Snape and wanted to make reparations. It's no accident that Snape's uttering of always has been inked into many Potter fans. And also our hero Harry keens in complexity when it becomes evident that some of Voldemort's badness is within himself. As we've discussed before, the paranoid-schizoid position is activated when we are in a state of fight, assertion, when we don't know if we survive, as this position fends off annihilation anxiety. Klein writes, "The fact that a good relation to its mother and to the external world helps the baby to overcome its early paranoid anxiety throws a new light on the importance of its earliest experiences. If we received love, good enough care, and established a first basis of the good inner object in the first few months, the fear of death gradually diminishes. There is enough goodness inside of us to neutralize more of our destructive impulses. With decreasing annihilation anxiety, the need for splitting and projection diminishes, and we are able to perceive ourselves and others in a whole new way. Others get to be themselves and not just a repository for parts of us. Our caregiver didn't frustrate us because they're evil. Rather, they're imperfect, fallible people just like us. Likewise, we start realizing that we have the capacity for hate and destruction. It's part of us, and we are not, just all good and purely the victim of evil out there. This sets off another type of anxiety. Klein actually developed the concept of the depressive position before the paranoid-schizoid position, mostly in her paper, A Contribution to the Psychogenesis of Manic Depressive States in 1935. And the depressive position is called depressive because it deals with the depressive anxiety of losing the good object and being abandoned. When we realize that the good and bad object are the same person, we discover the concept of ambivalence. From a modern perspective, ambivalence means having loving and hateful feelings towards the same person. Understanding it in this way, we can see that it is actually a developmental achievement. If we experience a reasonable level of ambivalence, we have arrived in reality where nothing is black and white. We have developed the mental capacity to contain complexity, which also means we have taken a step back from the illusions of omnipotence and have come to realize our dependence. The great loss of this position is that we need to let go of our belief of paradise and perfection. The paranoid-schizoid position, in that position, perfect union is still possible with a perfect object, perfect love, and now we have to settle for good enough. When we realize that we carry destructive impulses inside of us, that we are also good and bad, we feel great remorse over how we treated the bad object. We become really guilty. The paranoid-schizoid position was all about the self and saving the self from destruction. Even the part object was, just another extension of the self to store the bad parts in. And now the depressive position is focused on the object, and the self. And it's about saving the good inner object from destruction. Therefore, we start to make reparations. The defenses of this position have a lot to do with finding ways to navigate our feelings of guilt and manage our destructive impulses to allow for satisfying relationships with others. If this position is worked through well enough, we can take on responsibility for our own aggression, find compromises with others, while not losing us in a net of overwhelming guilt or manically abdicating responsibility altogether. This position requires us to use our new capacities to solve inner conflicts and find new ways to deal with frustrations. And therefore, if we navigate and work through this position well, we develop the capacity for mature love, for empathy, responsibility, and creativity. There's a bunch of other concepts to dive into, such as projective identification, envy, psychopathology, the dangers of excessive introjection and projection, Melanie Klein's understanding of the superego, and so much more. But I need to end this video here with criticism about Kleinians and their theories. My first personal criticism is the terminology. I dislike the terms Klein uses so much. It makes it more complicated than it needed to be, in my opinion, and it feels like she needed to impress the other male university-educated analysts to compensate. Also, I can't read her or other clients' case studies. Even just in the papers that I mentioned in this video, they are full of very, primitive terms. Everything is about penises, vaginas, feces. I don't find it appealing or helpful. The second criticism is about treatment. Now, I have never been in Kleinian analysis, but from talking with some of my patrons in my book club, I've heard that, their approach is very direct, to put it lightly. They interpret ruthlessly. Someone, benefited from the bluntness of it, and another equated it to a rectal exam. I recently also came across an article written by someone who recognized themselves in a case study written by a Kleinian analyst. I linked that below. That was quite the read. And as I said, I've never worked with a Kleinian analyst, but this is the criticism I heard and can imagine well from studying Klein. Then, of course, there's a lot of criticism on her theory from being too focused on aggression, not taking the real caregivers into account enough, misrepresenting concepts. And it's a little ironic that Klein's view split the psychoanalytic society into two camps, the Kleinians and the followers of Anna Freud, with one of her harshest critics actually being Klein's own daughter, Melita. In general, we need to take into account that the followers of a thinker tend to be more radical than the thinker herself. And theorists, such as Melanie Klein, Sigmund Freud, Heinz Kohut, Alice Miller, they tend to develop theories that are based on their own personality style and struggles. As Nancy Malcolm Williams put it, either to confirm or to balance them. If you're curious to work, read, or learn more with me, check out the links in the description box to various offers. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.